The envelope felt cold in my hands, a stark, clinical white against the warm, worn wood of my kitchen table. I remember tracing the embossed logo of the laboratory with my fingertip, the ridges and valleys feeling like a map to a destination I was terrified to reach. Outside, a gentle afternoon rain had begun to fall, each drop tracing a lonely path down the window pane, blurring the world outside into a watercolor of muted greens and grays. The house was silent, a deep, profound silence that seemed to amplify the frantic beating of my own heart. It was a silence I had grown accustomed to over the past few months, a hollow echo of the life that once filled these rooms with noise and chaos and love. Just 10 weeks ago, this same kitchen had been the stage for the most devastating performance of my life, a confrontation that shattered the very foundation of who I was. My son, my beautiful boy with the same chestnut eyes as my own father, had stood right where I was sitting now, his face contorted with an anger so pure it stole the air from my lungs. "You were a terrible mother," he had said, each word a carefully aimed dagger. "You were never enough, and I finally understand why." The memory of those words still had the power to bring a physical ache to my chest, a sharp, twisting pain beneath my ribs. I had replayed that moment 1,000 times, searching for a clue, a reason, anything that could explain the nuclear bomb he had dropped on our relationship. And now the answer was here, sealed within this innocuous-looking envelope. This wasn't just a DNA test result. It was a key to a lock I never knew existed, a door I was afraid to open because I had no idea what monster or what truth was waiting for me on the other side. My entire life, my entire identity as a mother was condensed in this single flimsy packet. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of stale coffee and the faint floral note of my hand cream suddenly overwhelming. This was it, the end of one story, or perhaps the brutal beginning of another. I slid my thumb under the flap, the paper tearing with a sound that seemed to rip through the very fabric of the quiet afternoon. My life, for the longest time, was defined by a simple, powerful symphony of sounds. The frantic pitter-patter of little feet running down the hallway at dawn, the joyous, uninhibited shrieks of laughter during Saturday morning cartoon marathons, the soft, rhythmic sound of a rocking chair, and my own voice humming lullabies that had been passed down through generations. I was Clara, and for 28 years, my greatest pride, my entire world was my son Liam. His father, Michael, was a story that belonged to my youth, a brief, passionate summer romance that ended before the leaves had even begun to turn. He was a musician with soulful eyes and fingers that could make a guitar weep. Our time together was a whirlwind of late-night drives and whispered dreams. But his dreams were bigger than our small town. And when a tour offer came up, he left with a promise to return that slowly faded into the static of long-distance calls and unanswered letters. I discovered I was pregnant 2 weeks after his last postcard arrived from a city I couldn't even pronounce. I was 19, scared, and utterly alone. The decision to keep Liam wasn't a dramatic, tear-filled choice. It was a quiet, fierce certainty that settled deep in my bones. He was mine. I took a job as a receptionist at a local dental office, a job I would hold for the next 25 years. It was a life built on routines and small comforts. Our home was a modest 2-bedroom cottage with a garden that I tended to with a kind of desperate love, as if by forcing roses to bloom, I could ensure a beautiful life for my son. I was his mother and his father.
I was the one who bandaged scraped knees and helped with science projects on the solar system, my fingers clumsy with blue and styrofoam balls. I was the one who sat in the audience for every school play, my heart swelling with a pride so immense it felt like it would burst out of my chest as he stood on stage squinting under the bright lights. I was the one who taught him to drive, my knuckles white on the passenger side handle, my voice calm even as my pulse raced. I was the one who worked double shifts to save for his college tuition, coming home with my feet aching and my smile tired, but always with a kiss for his forehead as he slept. Our relationship, as he grew into a man, was close, or so I believed. He was a quiet child, thoughtful, with a tendency to internalize his feelings. I attributed it to his artistic nature. He was always sketching in notebooks, filling the margins with fantastical creatures and intricate patterns. He looked so much like my side of the family that it was a running joke at every holiday gathering. "He's got the Henderson nose, poor kid," my Uncle Carl would say, ruffling his hair. And his eyes were a perfect mirror of my father's. A warm, deep brown that could look both incredibly kind and terribly sad. I saw my own history, my own bloodline, reflected back at me every time I looked at him. It was my proof, my daily reassurance that despite the absence of a father, we were a complete family. A unit of two bound by an unbreakable chain of love and shared history. He met Sarah during his final year of college. She was bright, ambitious, and came from a world of financial security that was foreign to us. Her parents were lawyers and country club members. I was a dental receptionist who grew vegetables in her backyard. I saw the way she looked at our small, cluttered home, her eyes briefly scanning the thrift store furniture and the family photos in mismatched frames. But Liam was in love, and so I welcomed her with open arms, baking her favorite lemon bars and listening intently to her stories about international travel and graduate school plans. After they married, they moved to the city, about an hour away. The distance felt greater. Our weekly dinners became monthly, and our phone calls grew shorter, filled with polite updates about work and vacations I wasn't invited on. I felt him slipping away, a slow, gradual drift that I told myself was normal, a son growing up, building his own life. I filled the silence with volunteer work at the local library, with my garden, with waiting for the next phone call, the next visit, the next echo of the symphony that used to be my life.
The shift was subtle at first, like a cloud passing over the sun on a warm day. It was in the tone of his voice during our calls, a new impatience that I hadn't heard before. It was in the way he'd correct small, insignificant details in my stories, as if my memory of his own childhood was somehow flawed. He started making comments about my life, my choices. "You're still at that dental office, Mom? Haven't you ever wanted to do more?" he'd ask. And the question, though phrased casually, felt like a judgment. Sarah's influence was palpable, a silent third party in our conversations. I pushed my unease down, attributing it to the natural friction between a mother and her adult son. I told myself he was under pressure at his new job, that he was just finding his way. Then came the weekend of my 55th birthday. They were supposed to come for a celebratory dinner. I had spent days cleaning, cooking, baking his favorite chocolate cake. The table was set with my mother's good china, a rare extravagance. The hours ticked by. No Liam, no Sarah, no phone call. Finally, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Liam. "Sorry, something came up. Sarah's parents are in town unexpectedly. We'll try for next weekend." I stared at the screen, the words blurring. The unexpected visit, I could understand. The lack of a phone call, the casual dismissal of a birthday dinner I had so carefully prepared, felt like a punch to the gut. I sat alone at the beautifully set table, the food growing cold, and I allowed myself, for the first time, to cry. It wasn't just about the missed dinner. It was about the pattern, the accumulating weight of 1,000 small neglects.
The real betrayal, however, happened on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday evening. I had driven into the city to return a book Liam had left at my house months ago, a worn copy of a fantasy novel he had loved as a teenager. It was an excuse, I knew, just to see him. I used my key to let myself in, calling out a soft hello. The apartment was quiet, but I could hear the faint murmur of voices from the balcony. I walked towards the kitchen to leave the book on the counter, and that's when I heard them. Their voices, clear and unfiltered, floated in from the open balcony door. I just don't know how much longer I can pretend to enjoy those tedious dinners, Sarah was saying, her voice a light, dismissive ripple. She asks the same questions every time. And that house, it always smells like mothballs and old lady. My breath hitched. I stood frozen in the middle of their sleek, modern kitchen, a place that felt as alien to me as a museum exhibit. Then Liam's voice. My son's voice. I know, it's embarrassing. She never evolved, you know? She's stuck in this small town mentality. She was a terrible mother in so many ways. The world tilted. A terrible mother. The words hung in the air, toxic and suffocating. What do you mean? Sarah asked, her voice dripping with morbid curiosity. She was just never enough, Liam continued, and I could almost hear the shrug in his tone. She was always working, always tired. She never had any ambition. She let her whole life revolve around me, and it was smothering. And honestly, I think there was always something missing in her, something broken. I finally understand why my father left. Who could blame him? I felt the book slip from my fingers. It hit the tiled floor with a dull, final thud. The sound must have carried because the voices on the balcony stopped abruptly. A moment later, Liam appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of shock and then quickly defensiveness. Mom, what are you doing here? I looked at him, at this man I had built my life around. I saw the familiar curve of his jaw, the Henderson nose, my father's eyes, and in that moment, they looked like a cruel mockery. I was never enough, I whispered, my voice trembling. I repeated his own words back to him, each one tasting like ash. A terrible mother. His face flushed. You were eavesdropping? I was bringing you your book, the one you loved so much, the one I read to you every night for a year. I looked from his guilty face to Sarah's, who stood behind him, her expression a mixture of annoyance and contempt. I'm so sorry my love was so smothering. I'm so sorry my life, the life I built for you, is such an embarrassment to you now. Mom, it's not like that, he started, but the lie was so transparent, it was insulting. It's exactly like that, I said, cutting him off. My heart wasn't just breaking, it was shattering, disintegrating into a million tiny irreparable pieces. You told your wife I was a terrible mother. You said you understand why your father left. You have no idea, Liam. You have no idea about any of it. I turned and walked out, leaving the book on the floor. I walked out of his apartment, out of his life, it seemed. The drive home was a blur of hot, silent tears and a pain so profound it was a physical presence in the car with me. He had taken the narrative of my life, a story of sacrifice and devotion, and rewritten it as a tragedy of failure and lack. And his final, cruelest cut was his sympathy for the father who had abandoned us without a second thought.
The weeks that followed were a gray, emotional limbo. Liam didn't call. Not to apologize, not to explain. The silence was his answer. It confirmed everything. My days felt hollowed out. I'd go to work, smile at patients, file charts, and all the while his words played on a loop in my mind. Terrible mother. Never enough. Smothering. I started to question everything. Had I been too clingy? Should I have dated more? Built a more independent life for myself? Was my love really a burden? I looked at the photo albums that chronicled our life together. Pictures of Christmases, birthdays, beach vacations, and now all I could see was the desperate, striving mother and the son who felt suffocated by her affection.
The financial pressure began to mount as well. My old car, a faithful companion for over a decade, finally gave out, requiring repairs that cost nearly a month's salary. The roof on my cottage started to leak after a heavy storm, leaving an ugly brown watermark on the ceiling of the living room. These were problems I would have once discussed with Liam. He would have offered advice, maybe even come over on a weekend to help me patch it up. Now, the leaking roof felt like a metaphor for my entire life, a slow, steady drip of decay that I was powerless to stop on my own. I felt my age in a way I never had before. I felt the weight of my solitude, the stark reality of a future that stretched out before me, lonely and uncertain. I tried to reach out once, a fragile olive branch in the form of a text message. "I miss you. Can we talk?" The reply took hours to come. "I think we need some space right now. What you did, showing up and eavesdropping, was a major violation of trust." I stared at the message, a fresh wave of disbelief washing over me. He had recast himself as the victim. My pain, my betrayal, was now my transgression. It was then that the first faint whisper of a thought entered my mind. It was a thought born of deep, festering hurt. His defense of his father, his absolute conviction that the man was justified in leaving, it felt unnatural. It felt planted. It was in this storm of emotional turmoil that I remembered the box.
Tucked away at the top of my closet in a dusty cardboard box labeled Liam's Keepsakes was a smaller, wooden box. Inside were the few remnants I had of Michael. There weren't many. A few faded photographs, a mixtape he'd made for me, the handwritten track list now barely legible, and a single folded letter, the paper so thin and fragile it felt like it might crumble to dust. It was the last letter he ever sent me, postmarked from a city hundreds of miles away. I had read it so many times in the first year he was gone that I had practically memorized it. The flowery apologies, the promises that he'd come back for me when he made it, the vague but exciting descriptions of life on the road. For decades, I had viewed this letter as evidence of love that was real, but ultimately not strong enough to last. But now, with Liam's venomous words echoing in my mind, I read it again with new, older, and far more cynical eyes. I was no longer a heartbroken teenage girl. I was a woman who had been called a terrible mother by her only child. And this time, a single sentence, buried in the middle of all his poetic ramblings, jumped out at me as if it were printed in bold red ink. He wrote, "I know things are complicated and the timing is crazy, but no matter what happens, I'll always care for you. No matter what happens." It was a throwaway line, a cliché. Every person ending a relationship used it, but why did he use it then? Our relationship wasn't complicated. It was simple. He left to pursue his dream and didn't want the burden of a girlfriend, let alone a family back home. The timing wasn't crazy. It was just poor. As I sat on the floor of my bedroom, surrounded by the ghosts of my past, another memory surfaced, one I had suppressed for decades. It was a conversation I'd had with Michael's older sister, Brenda, a few months after he left. I had called her, desperate for news, for any information about where he was, if he was okay. She had been strangely cold, almost dismissive. "He's moved on, Clara," she had said, her tone final. "You should too. It's for the best." At the time, I thought she was just being protective of her brother. Now, it felt like a warning she had been instructed to deliver. A cold, sickening dread began to pool in my stomach. What if Michael's departure wasn't the spontaneous flight of a restless artist? What if it was a strategic retreat? The thought was so monstrous, I almost laughed out loud. But it wouldn't leave. I finally understand why my father left.
Liam's words were a key, turning a lock I never knew existed. That night, I went online. I found a DNA testing kit from a major company. It was a simple process, just a swab of the cheek mailed in a prepaid box. It felt absurd, a dramatic overreaction fueled by heartbreak. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing, its roots twisting around the very core of my identity. I ordered the kit. When it arrived, I swabbed my cheek, sealed the vial, and sent it off into the void. A message in a bottle tossed into a vast genetic ocean. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I would get the results, see that Liam was 50% my son, and feel a fool for ever doubting him. I would have my proof, and then I would have to find a way to mourn the living son who had so callously rejected me. I never, not for a single moment, considered the other possibility.
The weeks of waiting for the results were a lesson in quiet endurance. The initial raw agony had subsided, replaced by a low, constant hum of anxiety. I moved through my days mechanically. I went to work, I tended my garden, pulling weeds with a focused intensity. I avoided the family photos that lined the hallway. Turning their faces to the wall felt too dramatic, but seeing them was a fresh pain every time. My friends noticed my quietness. "You've lost your spark, Clara," one of them said over coffee. I just smiled a thin, tired smile and said, "I was feeling a bit under the weather." How could I possibly explain that I was secretly waiting for a scientific report that would tell me if the son I raised was biologically mine? It sounded like the plot of a bad daytime television drama. But this quiet period was also a time of immense internal shift. The woman who had been defined solely by her motherhood was slowly receding. In her place was someone harder, sadder, but also more clear-eyed. I began to take stock of my life not as Liam's mother, but as Clara. I looked at my finances with a new, pragmatic eye. I met with a financial advisor at my bank, a kind, no-nonsense woman named Gloria, to discuss my retirement plans, which were, frankly, paltry. I had always assumed Liam would be there. If not to support me financially, then at least to be a presence in my life. That assumption was now a shattered vase on the floor. I needed a new plan. I started looking into downsizing, into selling the cottage that held so many memories and moving into a small, manageable apartment. The thought was heartbreaking, but it also felt like an act of reclaiming my own future. I also did something I had never done before. I started researching Michael. It was surprisingly easy in the age of the internet. I found him. He was still in the music industry, not a star, but a respected session musician and producer living in Nashville. He was married. He had 2 other children, both girls, in their late teens. I looked at the pictures of his family on a social media profile that was set to public. They looked happy, normal. He looked older, his hair graying, but his smile was the same. I felt a strange detachment. There was no anger, no residual love. He was just a man, a stranger who held a piece of a puzzle I was trying to solve. I didn't contact him. That wasn't the plan. The plan was simply to know. Knowledge was power, and for the first time in my life, I was gathering power for myself, not for my son. I was preparing for any eventuality. If the test confirmed he was my son, I would have to find a way to build a new, distant relationship with him, one with firm boundaries, or learn to live with him entirely. And if the test revealed something else, well, I didn't let my mind go there often. But when it did, I felt a terrifying, steely calm. I would be ready. The day the email arrived, my hands were so cold I could barely type my password. The notification was simple. Your DNA results are ready. I clicked the link, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The website loaded slowly. There was my name, my ethnicity estimate, a unremarkable mix of European backgrounds that matched what I knew of my family history. I scrolled down, my eyes scanning past the charts and the percentages, looking for the one piece of information that mattered. DNA matches. Parent-child match. 0. The world stopped. The words on the screen seemed to pixelate and swim before my eyes. 0. There was no parent-child match. I read it again and again. It was a biological impossibility. Liam was not my son. A sound escaped my lips, a strangled gasp that was part sob, part laugh of pure, unadulterated shock. I wasn't his mother. For 28 years, I had believed I was his mother, but I wasn't. The foundation of my entire existence crumbled into dust in that single silent moment. I sat there for what felt like an eternity. The hum of the computer was the only sound in the ringing silence. All the memories, the pregnancy, the birth, bringing him home, they were all real, weren't they? I had felt him kick. I had gone through 22 hours of labor. I had held him, a tiny, squalling infant, and counted his fingers and toes. How could he not be mine? The answer, when it came, was not a thunderclap, but a slow, dawning, horrifying realization. The hospital. A small, rural hospital that was understaffed and chaotic. There had been another woman, I suddenly remembered. A vague, shadowy memory from a haze of pain and exhaustion. A woman who had given birth to a boy around the same time I had. I remembered a brief conversation, her saying she was alone, that the father was out of the picture. I remembered a nurse, a brisk, efficient woman with a kind smile, who had taken our babies for routine checks. Could it be? Was it possible that a mistake, a simple, tragic, unimaginable mistake, had been made nearly 30 years ago? I scrolled further down the DNA match list. There, at the top, was another name. Liam Robertson. It listed him as a match, but not as my son. The website estimated the relationship first cousin. First cousin. That meant my mind, reeling, tried to grasp the genetics. It meant his parent was my sibling. I was an only child. The only other person it could be was Michael. Michael was his father. But if I wasn't his mother and Michael was his father, then who? I clicked on Liam's profile. It was bare, but it showed his connected family tree. And there, linked as his mother, was a name I knew, Brenda, Michael's sister. The room spun. Brenda, the woman who had told me to move on, the woman who was cold and dismissive. She hadn't just been protecting her brother, she had been protecting herself. She had given birth to Liam. Michael was the father. The pieces of the puzzle, a puzzle I never knew I was solving, slammed into place with a force that left me breathless. Michael and Brenda, a secret pregnancy, a family desperate to avoid a scandal. They had seen me, a young, naive girl, pregnant at the same time, alone and vulnerable. Had they orchestrated this? Had that kind-faced nurse been paid off? Was the entire thing a monstrous, calculated swap? I didn't know what to feel. The betrayal was so vast, so multi-layered, it was almost abstract. It wasn't just Liam who had betrayed me. It was Michael. It was Brenda. It was the entire institution I trusted to bring my child safely into the world. The son I had raised, the boy I had loved with every fiber of my being, was not my son. He was my nephew. And the woman he now defended, the father he sympathized with, were his biological parents. They had stolen my child, my real child, from me. The thought was a black hole, sucking all the light and sound from the room. Where was my baby? What had they done with my son?
I had printed the results. The papers were warm from the printer, the ink smudging slightly under my trembling fingers. I didn't have a grand plan. I had only a single driving need, the truth. I got into my car and began the long drive to the city, to Liam's apartment. I didn't call. I didn't text. I just drove, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, the printed DNA results sitting on the passenger seat like a silent passenger. When I knocked on his door, it was Sarah who answered. Her face immediately tightened into a mask of annoyance. "Clara, what are you doing here? Liam said he needed space." "I need to speak with him," I said, my voice eerily calm. Liam appeared behind her, his expression a mixture of anger and weariness. "Mom, this isn't helping. I told you." I didn't let him finish. I held out the papers. "I'm not your mother, Liam." The sentence hung in the air, absurd and devastating. Sarah's jaw dropped slightly. Liam stared at me as if I had lost my mind. "What are you talking about? Have you completely lost it?" "Read it," I said, my voice still quiet, but firm. He took the capers, his eyes scanning them with impatient confusion. I watched his face as he read. I saw the moment his brain processed the words parent-child match 0. His brow furrowed. He looked from the paper to me, then back to the paper. He scrolled down, his eyes widening as he saw his own profile listed as my first cousin. He saw the name Brenda Robertson linked as his mother. The color drained from his face. The defensive, angry man was gone, replaced by a confused, frightened boy. This is a mistake," he stammered. "This is some kind of sick joke. Why would you do this?" "It's not a joke, Liam." And for the first time, my voice cracked with the emotion I had been holding back. "The woman you've been defending, Brenda, is your biological mother. Michael is your father. They gave you to me. They let me raise you as my own, and they never, ever told us the truth." He sank onto the sofa, the papers falling from his hands and scattering on the floor. Sarah stood frozen, her hand over her mouth. The silence in their chic apartment was absolute. "All those years," I whispered, tears finally streaming down my face freely. "You said I was a terrible mother. You said you understood why your father left. The cruelest irony is that the father you sympathized with and the aunt you barely knew are the very people who committed this unforgivable act against both of us. They stole my child from me, and they stole you from your real mother, which was me in every way that ever mattered for 28 years.
What followed was not a Hollywood reconciliation. It was messy, painful, and complicated. Liam was shattered. The bedrock of his identity had been pulled out from under him. The parents he knew were not his parents. The man he thought had abandoned him was his father. The mother he had rejected was the aunt who had raised him as her own. He and Sarah retreated into a shell of shock and confusion. I left them that day, the truth hanging heavy in the air between us. There was no immediate tearful embrace. There were lawyers involved, quiet, grim-faced men who discussed the statute of limitations and the horrific legal implications of what amounted to baby trafficking. There was a tense, agonizing meeting with the now aged Brenda, who, faced with the DNA evidence, broke down and confessed to a story of teenage pregnancy, family shame, and a desperate, terrible decision made by her and her brother. My own son, my biological child, had been stillborn. In a state of grief and panic, and with the help of a complicit nurse, they had switched the babies, giving me their problem and telling me my child had died. They had buried a tiny, unnamed casket while I was sedated with grief. The depth of their deception was bottomless. Liam eventually came to see me, months later. He was a shadow of his former self,
humbled and heartbroken. He apologized over and over for the cruel things he had said. "I was wrong," he cried, sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where I had opened the envelope. "Everything I said was wrong. You were my mother. You are my mother." I forgave him. How could I not? He was as much a victim in this as I was. But forgiveness doesn't erase the scars. Our relationship is different now. It's quieter, more fragile. We are two survivors of the same shipwreck, trying to build a new raft from the broken pieces. We go to therapy together. We talk about the past, not with blame, but with a shared, profound sadness for the lives we were supposed to have. I never confronted Michael. I decided that my peace was more valuable than his guilt. I sold the cottage and moved into a small, bright apartment that holds no ghosts. I plant flowers on my balcony instead of in a garden. The symphony of my life is different now. It's not the loud, joyous noise of childhood, but a softer, more complex piece of music, with notes of sorrow, strains of resilience, and a quiet, steady melody of hard-won peace. The moral of my story isn't about revenge. It's about the terrifying, beautiful fragility of the stories we tell ourselves. We build our identities on the foundations of memory and blood. But sometimes the blood is a lie and the memory is a shared fiction. The greatest strength isn't in never being broken. It's in finding the courage to piece yourself back together, even when the picture looks entirely different from the one you knew.
If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt the ground shift beneath your feet and had to rebuild your understanding of who you are, then you understand that life's most profound challenges often come from the people and places we trust the most. My story is one of many. There are so many voices out there, each with their own tale of betrayal, realization, and quiet redemption. If you'd like to hear more of these real-life stories, these emotional journeys from women who have faced the unthinkable and found a way through, then please consider subscribing to this channel. By subscribing, you're not just watching videos, you're joining a community, a gentle space where we can share our truths and support one another. Your subscription means these stories can be told, and that others who are feeling alone in their pain might find a moment of comfort, a sense of solidarity. If this story moved you, feel free to leave a comment below. Sometimes just writing down your own thoughts can be a healing act. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for giving me this space to share my truth. It means more than you can ever know.